Investigation. The Architect of Shadows. If you walk down the cobblestone streets of London today, past the soot-stained bricks of Fleet Street and the clamor of the modern motor cars, you will eventually hear the name. It is whispered in coffeehouses and shouted by newsboys whenever a slow news day demands a resurrection of the past. Elias Thorne. The name itself tastes of ash and ozone. To the Royal Society, he was a pariah. To the public, a wizard. To the police, he remains the single most frustrating, chaotic variable in the history of Scotland Yard. The mystery of Elias Thorne is not merely that he vanished. People vanish in London every day. The Thames is greedy and the fog is thick. The mystery is that Elias Thorne vanished while 500 people were watching him, from inside a glass box suspended 20 feet in the air in the center of the Royal Albert Hall. But to understand the end, one must understand the man. Elias was a clockmaker by trade, but a philosopher by curse. He operated out of a crooked shop in Holborn, a place where the ticking of 1,000 clocks created a wall of sound so dense it felt physical. He was a man obsessed with the concept of intervals, the spaces between seconds, the silence between heartbeats. Time is not a river, he once told a reporter from the Times in 1924. It is a sieve, and if one is small enough or fast enough, one can slip through the mesh. No one took him seriously until he built the chronosphere. The invitations were sent out on heavy, cream-colored cardstock, the edges gilded with real gold leaf. They arrived at the doorsteps of the elite, the Prime Minister, the Commissioner of Police, the leading scientists of Oxford and Cambridge, and the skeptics who had spent years debunking spiritualists and parlor magicians. The text was simple. You are cordially invited to witness the impossible. November 12, 1926. The Royal Albert Hall, 8 p.m. Subject, the cessation of entropy. Elias Thorne. Arthur Pendleton, a detective inspector whose cynicism was as worn as the heels of his boots, received one. He didn't want to go. He hated magic shows. He hated the pretension of the upper class. But the commissioner insisted. Thorne has been making threats about altering physics, Arthur. Just go and make sure he doesn't blow up the stage. When Arthur arrived, the hall was vibrating with nervous energy. The sheer scale of the audience was staggering. Men in tuxedos and women in perils fanned themselves, whispering. In the center of the stage, bathed in the harsh glare of electric floodlights, stood the machine. It was a sphere, roughly 8 feet in diameter, constructed of brass gears, oscillating pistons, and thick, curved panels of glass. It looked like a diving bell designed by a madman. It hung from the ceiling by heavy industrial chains, suspended well above the stage floor. There were no trapdoors beneath it. There were no mirrors, just the sphere, floating in the empty air. At 8:15 p.m., the lights dimmed. A hush fell over the crowd, so profound that the creaking of the chains holding the sphere sounded like gunshots. Elias Thorne walked onto the stage. He was a tall man, gaunt, with eyes that seemed to burn with a feverish intensity. He wore a simple black suit, unadorned. He did not bow. He did not smile. He walked to the center of the stage, directly beneath the suspended sphere. Ladies and gentlemen, his voice rang out, amplified by the acoustics of the hall rather than a microphone. You have come to see a trick. You are hoping for smoke and mirrors. You want to see a rabbit pulled from a hat so you can go home and tell your children that magic is just sleight of hand. He paused, looking up at the brass contraption. I have no rabbits, Thorne said softly. I have only mathematics. A ladder was lowered. Thorne climbed it slowly. The crowd watched, mesmerized. He reached the hatch of the sphere, opened it, and climbed inside. The interior was visible to everyone. The glass was clear. Thorne stood in the center of the sphere, surrounded by dials and levers. He closed the hatch. A distinct clank echoed through the hall as the locking mechanism engaged. Arthur Pendleton watched through his opera glasses. He saw Thorne turn a large copper wheel. Inside the sphere, a light began to glow. It wasn't the warm yellow of an incandescent bulb, nor the harsh white of an arc lamp. It was a violet, pulsing luminescence that seemed to make the air inside the sphere ripple like heat rising off a summer pavement. The hum started low, a bass note that rattled the teeth of everyone in the front row. It grew louder, rising in pitch, a mechanical scream that tore at the ears. Then Thorne looked directly at the audience. He didn't look scared. He looked sad. He placed his hand against the glass. The sound cut out. Instantly. One moment, the hall was filled with the deafening whine of the machine. The next, absolute silence. And in that silence, the glass of the sphere shattered. It didn't explode outward, raining shards onto the stage. It turned into dust, fine, glittering sand that simply drifted away on an invisible draft. The brass frame of the sphere remained, swinging gently on the chains. The gears were still turning. The light was gone. And Elias Thorne was gone. The sphere was empty. For 10 seconds, the audience sat frozen, their brains trying to process the visual data. A man had been standing in a sealed glass box suspended 20 feet in the air. The glass had vanished. The man had vanished. Then, the screaming started. Arthur Pendleton was on the stage before the first scream died down. He vaulted the orchestra pit, his badge already in hand, shouting for the constables stationed at the exits to seal the doors. "Nobody leaves," Arthur roared. "Nobody!" The ladder was raised again. Arthur climbed it himself, his heart hammering against his ribs. He swung himself into the skeletal remains of the sphere. The brass floor was solid. There were no trapdoors. The chains above were solid steel, welded to the rafters. He checked the roof of the sphere, solid brass. Thorne hadn't climbed out. He hadn't fallen through. Arthur took out his handkerchief and wiped the brass controls. They were cold, ice cold. Condensation was forming on the metal, despite the heat of the stage lights. "He's not here," Arthur muttered to himself, the reality of it chilling his blood. "He's just not here." The search that followed was the most extensive in London's history. The Royal Albert Hall was torn apart. They checked the rafters, the basement, the ventilation shafts. They questioned every member of the audience. They stripped the stage floorboards. Nothing. No body, no blood, no footprints. The only piece of evidence recovered was a small pocket watch found resting on the floor of the sphere where Thorne had been standing. Arthur picked it up. The glass face was cracked, the hands were frozen. But they weren't frozen at 8:20 p.m., the time of the disappearance. The hands were missing entirely. 3 weeks later, the fervor had turned into a witch hunt. The papers claimed Thorne was a devil worshipper. Others claimed he was a Soviet spy who had used a new gas weapon to escape. Arthur Pendleton sat in the dusty silence of Thorne's Holborn shop. The police had raided it immediately, but they had found nothing but clocks, thousands of them. Arthur was tired. The case was a stone around his neck. He sat at Thorne's workbench, idly spinning the gears of a dismantled grandfather clock. His hand brushed against a loose panel under the desk. Arthur paused. He crouched down, pulling a penknife from his pocket. He pried the wood loose. Inside was a leather-bound book, Thorne's journal. Arthur opened it. The handwriting was jagged, frantic. The early entries were standard: equations, schematics for gears, complaints about the cost of brass. But as the dates approached November, the tone changed. October 14th. The barrier is thinner than I thought. It is not a wall, it is a curtain. The vibration of the tungsten alloy at the correct frequency creates a resonance. I saw it today. I saw the other room. October 20th. I am afraid. Not of dying. I am afraid of being stuck in the interval, the space between the tick and the talk. It is vast there, and it is lonely. November 1st. I have calculated the mass displacement. To leave this place, I must exchange my mass with something else. The law of conservation cannot be broken, only bent. If I leave, what comes back in my place? Arthur flipped to the final entry, written on the morning of the performance. November 12th. I am not performing a trick. I am performing an escape. The world is too loud. Time is too fast. I have found the quiet place. If I succeed, I will be everywhere and nowhere. Do not look for me. I am the silence in your watch. Arthur closed the book. He never entered the journal into evidence. He told the commissioner he found nothing. He burned the book in his fireplace that night, watching the pages curl and blacken. Why? Because Arthur Pendleton had realized something terrifying. Since the night of the disappearance, Arthur's own wristwatch had stopped ticking. He had bought a new one. It stopped too. Every clock Arthur stood near slowed down, losing minutes, then hours. He went back to the Royal Albert Hall one last time, alone, late at night. He stood on the stage, looking up at the empty space where the sphere had hung. The silence in the hall was absolute, but as Arthur stood there, he heard it. Faint, rhythmic, tick, tick, tick. It wasn't coming from a clock. It was coming from the air itself. The mystery of Elias Thorne shocked the world because they thought he had died or fled. They thought it was a murder or a hoax. But Arthur knew the truth that kept him awake at night, listening to the silence of his own house. Elias Thorne hadn't gone anywhere. He had succeeded. He had stepped into the interval. He was still there, in the Royal Albert Hall, in the space between the seconds, watching the world rush by, suspended in an eternal, frozen moment of perfection. The shock wasn't that he left. The shock was that he was still there, unseen, unheard, waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. 12 years later, London was burning. The Luftwaffe had turned the night sky into a canvas of fire and searchlights. The Blitz was at its height. Corporal James Miller, a man too old for the infantry but too stubborn to evacuate, was stationed as a fire watcher on the roof of the Royal Albert Hall. It was a terrifying post. The Great Dome, a landmark for German bombers, felt less like a shelter and more like a target. On the night of October 14th, the sirens wailed their mournful harmony. Miller adjusted his helmet, watching the incendiaries rain down on Kensington. The noise was deafening. The crump of high explosives, the roar of anti-aircraft guns, the crackle of fires. Then he heard the whistle. It was distinct, growing louder with a terrifying velocity. A 500-pound high-explosive bomb was dropping directly toward the hall. Miller threw himself flat against the lead roofing, covering his head, praying to a god he hadn't spoken to since the Psalm. He waited for the impact. He waited for the dome to shatter, for the fire to consume him. He heard the crash of the bomb punching through the glass and iron of the lantern roof above the auditorium. He braced for the detonation. 1 second passed. 2. 10. Miller lifted his head. The sky was still screaming, but the hall below him was silent. Cautiously, terrified that it was a delayed action fuse, Miller scrambled down to the maintenance hatch and peered down into the vast auditorium. The bomb had fallen straight through. It should have decimated the stalls. Instead, Miller saw something that made him question his sanity. The bomb was there, suspended in midair, 20 feet above the stage. It was frozen in the exact spot where Elias Thorne's sphere had hung 14 years prior. But it wasn't just floating. It was eroding. Miller watched in silence as the iron casing of the bomb began to flake away, turning into the same fine, glittering dust that the sphere had become. The explosives inside didn't detonate, they simply dissolved. It was as if the bomb had entered a space where the chemical reaction of an explosion was forbidden. A zone of zero entropy. Down on the stage, a figure was sitting in the gloom of the stalls, an old man, dressed in a faded trench coat. It was Arthur Pendleton, now retired, his hair white, his face lined with grief. Arthur wasn't looking at the bomb, he was looking at his wrist. Miller shouted down, his voice echoing in the vast chamber. "Hey, you down there, run, it's a dud." Arthur looked up, his eyes calm. He shouted back, his voice strangely clear despite the distance. "It's not a dud, Corporal, it's just late." "What do you mean?" "Time doesn't work here anymore," Arthur said, gesturing to the dissolving bomb. "He doesn't like the noise, he's quieting things down." By the time the bomb disposal squad arrived the next morning, there was nothing left of the bomb but a pile of metallic dust on the stage floor. The official report listed it as a structural deflection, but the squad leader noted in his private log that the dust was cold, absolute zero. If you visit the Royal Albert Hall today, you might notice the acoustics. They are world-renowned. Conductors say the silence in the hall is alive. In 2024, a team of audio engineers was setting up for a recording of a minimalist piano concerto. They were using new, high-sensitivity microphones capable of picking up frequencies outside the human range. During a sound check, the lead engineer, a woman named Sarah, noticed a spike on the spectral analyzer. "There's interference on channel 4, she said, tapping her screen. "Something in the 18 Hz range, infrasound." "Is it the HVAC system?" her assistant asked. "No, it's too rhythmic." Sarah isolated the frequency. She boosted the gain and slowed down the playback speed, trying to find the source of the mechanical hum. It wasn't a hum. Through the digital noise reduction, clear as a bell, came a sound. Tick, tick, tick. And then a voice. Faint, tinny, as if recorded on a wax cylinder a century ago, but unmistakably present in the digital waveform. "The mesh is tight, but it is peaceful here." Sarah saved the file. She labeled it Hall Ambiance Anomaly.wave and backed it up to the cloud. When she tried to open it the next day, the file was empty. The file size was 0 bytes. But the timestamp on the file modification wasn't 2024. It was November 12, 1926. The 100th anniversary of the disappearance was meant to be a quiet affair. The Royal Albert Hall trustees had agreed to a centenary gala, a black-tie performance of Holst's The Planets, to honor the scientific curiosity of the era. The public thought it was a concert. The three men sitting in the royal box knew it was a vigil. They were from the Department of Anomalous Physics, a budgetless, off-book division of British intelligence that had inherited Arthur Pendleton's files. They sat in the dark, checking Geiger counters disguised as opera glasses. "Readings are climbing," Agent Graves whispered as the orchestra began the opening movement, Mars, the bringer of war. "The entropy levels in the hall are dropping rapidly." "He's coming back," his colleague replied, "or he's inviting us in." At 8:20 p.m. precisely, as the music reached a crescendo, the conductor raised his baton for the final strike. The baton never came down. It wasn't that the conductor froze, it was that the sound died. The violins were sawing, the trumpets were blowing, the drums were being struck, but no sound emerged. The air had become too thick, too ordered to carry vibration. A silence, absolute and terrifying, descended on the 5,000 attendees. Panic should have ensued. Instead, a collective calm washed over the crowd. In that silence, the interval that Elias Thorne had spoken of expanded. For 60 seconds, every person in the hall saw the person sitting next to them not as they were, but as they were in time. They saw the child within the old man. They saw the skeleton within the beauty. They saw the decay and the growth simultaneously. Then a single sound broke the spell. Clang. It came from the center of the stage, directly below the spot where the sphere had once hung. The sound returned. The music crashed back in, chaotic and loud. The audience gasped, waking from the trance. The agents in the royal box leaned forward. Lying on the conductor's podium, shimmering under the stage lights, was a brass object. It hadn't fallen from the ceiling. It hadn't been thrown. It had simply materialized, displacing the air in an instant. It was a clock, but not just any clock. It was the master chronometer from Thorne's original sphere. Agent Graves rushed down to the stage, flashing his badge to clear the confused musicians. He approached the podium. The clock was pristine, polished brass, untouched by a century of oxidation, but the face was different. There were 3 hands, hour, minute, and second, and they were all moving counterclockwise. Graves picked it up. It was warm. He turned it over. Engraved on the back, in fresh, bright script that looked as if it had been cut seconds ago, was a message. The mesh is open. I am not alone anymore. We are waiting. Graves looked up at the empty air above the stage. He felt the vibration in his bones, a low, steady thrum that the rest of the world couldn't hear. The mystery hadn't ended. The invitation had just been renewed. 24 hours after the Gala incident, the Royal Albert Hall was officially closed for emergency structural renovations. The press was fed a story about asbestos in the ventilation. The reality was much worse. Agent Graves stood in the center of the auditorium, which had been transformed into a field laboratory. Thick black cables snaked across the plush velvet seats. Banks of servers hummed in the orchestra pit, their cooling fans screaming to dissipate the heat. In the center of the stage, isolated inside a containment unit made of 2-inch thick lead glass, sat the reverse chronometer. "It's not just counting down," said Dr. Eris Vane, the department's lead physicist. She adjusted her spectacles, looking at the telemetry data on her tablet. "It's pulling." "Pulling what?" Graves asked, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. "Mass," Vane replied. "It's a gravitational anchor. Think of it like a hook thrown from a ship. Thorne, or whatever Thorne has become, has snagged our reality. The clock is the hook, and he's reeling us in." Graves looked at the clock. The hands were spinning faster now. The second hand was a blur of motion, moving backwards with such speed it emitted a high-pitched whine. "Can we stop it?" "If we destroy the clock, the snapback might shatter the hall," Vane warned. "Maybe even half of Kensington. The energy potential stored in that spring is infinite. It's drawing power from the interval." "So we just wait?" "We wait," Vane said, her voice trembling slightly. The message said, "We are waiting." It implies a meeting. At 3 a.m., the temperature in the hall dropped 20 degrees in a single second. The server banks sparked and died. The emergency lights flickered out. The only illumination came from the containment unit on stage. The clock had stopped spinning. It began to glow with that same violet, sickly light that had been reported in 1926. And then the lead glass of the containment unit began to fog up, not with condensation, but with frost. Graves drew his service weapon, a futile gesture against physics, but it made him feel better. "Dr. Vane?" "I see it," she whispered. Inside the glass box, the air was thickening. It swirled like oil in water. And from that swirling darkness, a shape began to form. It wasn't human. It was architectural. It was a door. A simple wooden door, complete with a brass handle, standing upright in the middle of the glass box, unsupported by any frame. "Don't touch it," Graves ordered, though his voice lacked authority in the face of the impossible. The door opened. There was no creak of hinges. It simply swung inward, revealing nothing. Just a rectangular void of absolute static-filled darkness. And then things began to come out. They weren't monsters. They were echoes. First, the smell of cigar smoke, pungent and heavy, a brand that hadn't been sold since the 1930s. Then, the sound of applause. Polite, gloved applause, sounding as if it were coming from a great distance. Ghostly figures began to flicker in the auditorium seats. They were translucent, like bad television reception. Men in tails, women in flapper dresses. They weren't looking at Graves or Vane. They were looking at the stage, their faces frozen in expressions of awe and terror. "It's the audience," Vane realized. "From 1926. The bleed is overlaying their timeline onto ours." "Why?" Graves asked. "Because the door is a bridge," a voice said. It wasn't Vane. Graves spun around. Standing near the orchestra pit was a man. He wasn't translucent, he was solid. He wore a trench coat that looked like it had been dusted with gray flour. He held a lit cigarette, the smoke curling lazily in the frigid air. He looked exactly like the photos in the archives, though older, wearier. "Detective Inspector Pendleton?" Graves breathed. The figure smiled, but there was no humor in it. "I haven't been a detective inspector for a very long time, Agent. I'm just the doorman now." Graves lowered his gun. "You died in 1952. I saw your death certificate." "I did," Pendleton agreed. "Heart failure, very painful. But death is just another interval, isn't it? Elias taught me that. He caught me as I was slipping away, pulled me into the quiet." Pendleton walked past them, toward the containment unit. He placed a hand on the lead glass. It dissolved instantly, turning into that familiar glittering dust. He stood before the floating door. "He wants to show you," Pendleton said, turning to Graves. "He wants to show you that he didn't break the world. He saved it." "Saved it from what?" Vane asked. Pendleton pointed at the chronometer. "Entropy, decay, the end of all things. In there," he nodded at the door, "nothing ends. The tea is always hot. The sun is always setting. The moment is always perfect." "It's a stasis trap," Vane argued, "a hell." "Is it?" Pendleton asked softly. "Or is it a museum? Elias is lonely, Agent Graves. He has collected the bomb. He collected me. He collected the silence." Pendleton offered his hand. "He wants to collect you too, both of you, to bear witness. The interval is expanding. Soon, London will be part of the collection, unless—" "Unless what?" Graves stepped forward. "Unless you can convince him that time is worth the pain of passing. He has forgotten the beauty of an ending. You have to remind him." Graves looked at Vane. He looked at the impossible door, the swirling void, and the ghost of the detective who had started it all. He holstered his gun. "Dr. Vane," Graves said, "bring the clock." He stepped through the door. "Case status, critical breach, crossing event. Evidence file, 894-D, the doorman. Current directive, retrieval of Agent Graves. Prevention of localized reality collapse."